Have you ever wondered what happens to the human mind when sleep is taken away? Not for hours, but for days, maybe even weeks. And I'm not talking about ordinary insomnia. I'm talking about total deprivation. A body begging for rest, yet forced to stay awake even when every cell inside it screams to shut down. And what if I told you that during the Cold War, Soviet scientists may have attempted exactly that? And worse, that fragments, reports, and the erased documents suggest that something very similar might have actually been tested. My name is Thon, and this is Mito e Medo. And today, you're going to understand what is real and what is myth behind the infamous Russian sleep experiment. Roll the intro. The story of the Russian sleep experiment became famous online as one of the most disturbing creepypastas ever written. But the reason it grew so large isn't just the violence or the horror in it. It's because it sounds possible, terrifyingly possible. During the Cold War, both the United States and the Soviet Union plunged into a period of absolute paranoia. Each nation believed the other was secretly developing technologies capable of changing the direction of the war. And under that constant fear, things we consider impossible today, back then seemed like just another option. The truth is that military science of that era flirted with ethical limits that today would be unthinkable. Radiation testing, sensory isolation, exposure to unknown chemical substances, psychological manipulation, torture disguised as research. The perfect environment for a story like this to be born, or perhaps to be covered up. According to the legend, around 1940, 5 prisoners were sealed inside an airtight chamber and exposed to an experimental stimulant gas. The goal? Keep them awake for 15 consecutive days. The room was equipped with sensitive microphones and reinforced glass windows. Nothing inside went unobserved. They were monitored like lab rats. During the first few days, everything seemed relatively normal. They talked, complained, argued, tried to distract themselves. But irritation grew like a shadow slowly crawling across the room. As the hours passed, their conversations became more anxious, more aggressive, more unstable. Sleep deprivation doesn't just weaken the body, it distorts the mind. And that's exactly what began to happen. After a few days, the hallucinations started. At first, subtle ones. Shadows flickering in the corners, sounds that seemed to echo from nowhere inside the chamber. Whispers none of the 5 men admitted making. Then came the screams. Screams that didn't sound like they came from people, but from something being torn out of them. Extreme aggression, strange ritualistic behaviors, self-mutilation, and the level of madness so detached from humanity that it seemed impossible these men had walked into that room only days before. They say that in the end, they begged to stay awake, as if sleeping meant a true death, as if something was waiting for them the moment they closed their eyes. It is one of the strongest and most iconic creepypastas ever created, but how much of it could actually be based in fact? Before attempting to understand the Soviet angle, we need to understand what science knows about sleep deprivation and what happens when someone is pushed beyond limits that were never meant to be crossed. After 24 hours without sleep, the body loses coordination. Irritability increases. Mood swings become dramatic. Judgment collapses. At 48 hours awake, the brain shows clear signs of overload. Memory lapses occur, reflexes slow down, the first visual hallucinations appear. Flashes of light, non-existent movements, shadows gaining false autonomy. At 72 hours, the individual enters a state of deep paranoia. The mind begins creating its own narratives. Intrusive thoughts take over. Language becomes disorganized. Identity begins to fracture. After 96 hours, the brain enters microsleeps.
involuntary shutdowns lasting seconds but capable of causing fatal mistakes. It's as if the body is saying, "I can't take this anymore. If you don't let me rest, I'll shut down myself." This extreme limit is exactly where real science meets the horror of the legend, because everything the story describes is simply a grotesque exaggeration of something that does happen. But what about the Soviets? How far did they really go? Declassified documents from the 1990s show that yes, Soviet experiments involving sleep deprivation did exist. Not as extreme as the creepypasta describes, but extreme enough to cause severe damage. Some prisoners were kept awake for up to 5 days using chemical stimulants. Soldiers were studied to measure endurance during prolonged combat conditions. Reports describe psychotic collapses, violent episodes, aggressive behavior, and even deaths. None of this reaches the monstrous scale of the legend, but it creates an unsettlingly real foundation that makes the story believable. And then there are the projects that truly existed. Sensory isolation tests where individuals were left in completely silent, dark rooms until they lost their sense of time. Chemical enhancement experiments to keep soldiers awake. Radiation tests that sacrificed entire crews, such as in the K-19 project, and the infamous Laboratory 12, where dangerous compounds were administered to prisoners under absolute secrecy. All under the same philosophy: if it could be used as a weapon, it must be studied. There is no official document describing anything as extreme as the creepypasta, but there are loose pieces, fragments that don't fit. Reports mentioning inhuman behavior, confusing notes describing complete loss of sanity, references to subjects speaking with voices that were not there, and an incomplete document mentioning something called a sensory gateway, a term no one has been able to explain. Despite everything, it is possible to clearly separate fiction from what has a real historical basis. The legend exaggerated by creating a mysterious stimulant gas, a perfect sealed chamber, the absurd duration of 15 days without sleep, and especially the elements of superhuman strength and grotesque mutations. That is fiction. But what exists behind it is more real than we'd like to admit. The Soviets truly studied how far the mind and body could be pushed. They truly placed human beings in extreme conditions. They truly forced biological and psychological limits in an attempt to craft tireless soldiers. They truly produced paranoia, collapse, violence, and permanent damage. The story works because it taps into our deepest fears, not the fear of monsters under the bed, but the fear of what happens inside our own minds when we lose control. The fear that without sleep, the mind begins creating its own demons. Demons that feel far more real than anything outside the body. Sleep deprivation is one of the cruelest tortures ever documented, and it has been used in wars, interrogations, and secret prisons, because it doesn't just destroy the body, it destroys consciousness itself. And that is why this legend continues to live. Not because it is supernatural, but because it could have happened. Or it could happen again. In the end, the Russian experiment did not occur the way the creepypasta describes. No one grew black eyes, superhuman strength, or demonic behavior, but it symbolizes something real, something unsettling. The question isn't if the legend is true. The question is, how many experiments were never revealed? How many reports were destroyed before anyone read them? How many bodies were buried without names, without causes, without explanation? Perhaps the scariest part of this story isn't what it tells. It's what it hides. The silences, the empty spaces in the files, the erased archives, the reports that vanished when the Soviet Union fell. Because what truly terrifies us is not the monster in the legend. It's the possibility that maybe something like this did happen, and we will never know. My name is Thon, and this is O Mito e o Medo. And if you enjoy diving into stories that mix science, secrecy, and shadows, subscribe. There is still so much hidden in this world.